Okay, this is our discussion of the Eastern Orthodox Doctrine of Theosis, and it accompanies a video in the course Justification and Sanctification by an Orthodox priest. So this is really a supplemental lecture. So if you want more information about um, Eastern Orthodox Theosis, there are several resources for that um, online. I would suggest getting anything written by Timothy Ware, Callistos Ware. Um, does a very good job of connecting Eastern Orthodoxy, helping the West understand Eastern Orthodoxy, which, by the way, you may be interested to know that that 5 years ago, there was less than a million Orthodox, if I have this number correctly. I want to say nationally, there's less than a million Orthodox nationally. That doesn't feel right, but I think that's the number. Uh, but today there's around 10 million. So in 5 years, the Eastern Orthodox Church has really taken off. And I may have those numbers incorrect. I was in a seminar today, and we were talking about the state of theological education and the state of the church in the United States, and someone threw out those numbers. So I may be wrong about that, but I heard that today while attending a PhD course at Regent. Um, but what you find is that most Protestant or evangelical theology, um, when we when we look at the history of the Christian church, we will study the Christian church up until 1054, and then we will follow the 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 trajectory of the Western Church, which was affiliated with Rome, eventually became Roman Catholicism, and then the Protestant Reformation, and then we sort of follow Christianity into North America, United States. And that's really the track that we stay on. And so, most people, most Protestants, most evangelicals have very little understanding of this entire ancient tradition that is very, very appealing to people who are tired of the sort of the shifting theological sands that you find in Protestantism. And this ancient tradition that we refer collectively as Eastern Orthodox. And so what I want to do tonight, I just want to back up and kind of offer a historical perspective so that you kind of understand the the position, at least, that the Orthodox Church takes. So if you go back to 1054, there was an event in the Christian church that most church historians call the Great Schism. And it really started before 1054, really around the fourth or really the fifth century, not the fourth, really the fifth century. You start to see the bishop over the church at Rome begin to teach that the Roman bishop had authority over the other chief bishops. So when you think about the Christian church that started in Acts chapter 2. You had the church in Jerusalem, and then it kind of built out from there. But the way that the Christian church responded to growth was through the office of the bishop. So you would have bishops over towns, and then you would eventually, the Christian church put bishops over regions. So it was, um, if you think about an organization, a corporation, you may have the home office, and then you would have um, the regional managers, and then area managers, and then maybe district managers, if you can think about it that way. And so this hierarchy of leadership developed in the Christian church, so that by 1054, you have these five main centers of Christian leadership that oversee the entire Christian church. And those bishops are located in the cities of Rome, Constantinople, which was the new capital. I don't know if you knew that or not, but Constantine actually moved the capital of Rome to Constantinople, which is the modern city of Istanbul. So the five centers of Christianity, or the five areas where the sort of the regional bishops were, was Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Egypt, or Antioch, Syria, Alexandria, Egypt, and Jerusalem. So Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. So around the 5th century, the bishop of the Church of Rome began to teach that because they were in Rome and because Peter was crucified in Rome, that there was this ceremonial advantage that the Roman bishop had. And so at the same time, so you have several factors that are sort of converging on the Christian church at the same time. So you have this doctrine that begins to develop out of Rome, that bishop had authority over the other bishops, which they didn't accept. And at the same time, you begin to see the Roman Empire begin to lose its authority and begin to collapse. Obviously, you know that when you have empires that collapse, seldom do they collapse overnight. It takes, sometimes decades for these empires to collapse. Well, as the Roman Empire began to collapse, the people in the former Roman Empire were Christian, or they attended a Christian church. And so the bishop became the most important, I don't want to say governmental, but the most important sort of legal official for the people in the absence of Rome. So as the Roman Empire began to decline, what happened was the Christians in the eastern part of the former Roman Empire were continuing to speak Greek. Remember, in the time of the New Testament, the language of trade was Greek. Even if you spoke, your language, everyone spoke Greek because of the way Alexander the Great devised his treaties when he overtook the Mediterranean, that area. So the people in the East continued to speak Greek, while the people in the West started to drop Greek and just speak Latin. So you have, sorry, my wife's trying to FaceTime me. So you have this power vacuum that elevates the power of the bishop. You have Eastern and Western, so you have different languages that are being spoken. At the same time, you see a couple of Christian traditions that are developing differently in the East and the West. In the East, they're celebrating Easter on a different day than the West, and they're using a different bread and communion than the West. And so you've got tensions that are created between the East and the West based on the Roman bishop thinks that they have more authority. They're celebrating Easter. The Christian church is celebrating Easter on a different day. They're using different bread and communion. And by the way, we don't speak the same languages anymore. So these tensions became so high that in 1054, the Roman bishop sent a delegation to Constantinople and excommunicated the bishop at Constantinople. So the response from Constantinople was to excommunicate the Bishop of Rome. We refer to that permanent rift that happened in 1054. We refer to it as the Great Schism. I don't, because essentially what happened, although I understand the language, essentially what happened was Rome left the other four, right? There were five major centers of Christianity. Rome went their own way because all the other four remained with the Eastern Church. But just for the sake of argument, let's refer to it as the Great Schism. Well, 500 years after the Great Schism in 1054, there was another schism in the Christian church, this time in the western part of the former Roman Empire under Roman Catholicism, and we call that the Protestant Reformation. And so you now, after the Protestant Reformation, you have three, even though there's more than this, because you have Coptic Christianity, you have Ethiopian Christianity, but just generally speaking, you have Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity, and Protestantism. So you have the Eastern Orthodox Church. That's what the East became known as. The West became known as Roman Catholicism or Roman Catholic. And then you have Protestantism. After 1054, now before 1054, there were already traditions that were developing in the East and West separate from each other, right? Easter on a different day, different communion. So what in the evangelical world, we tend to leave behind the formulation of traditions and doctrines in the East and focus on the West, because that's where Protestantism came from the West. But for our purposes tonight, what happens in the East is separate from Roman Catholics. The East begins to sort of formalize a doctrine of Christian maturity and Christian growth. And then on the Protestant side of things, eventually Protestants began to develop a doctrine of Christian growth. And it's called sanctification in the Protestant evangelical world. And it's called theosis in the Eastern Church. But they're different. They have similar goals from 30,000 feet. They sound similar, but they are a little bit different. And it all has to do with how Protestants and Eastern Orthodox think about salvation. So it's not unusual for a Protestant to say, I was saved on August 9, 1987, or to say, I am saved. So salvation for a Protestant is an event in time that happens to you. And once that happens to you, then you begin to enter into the sanctification phase of being a Christian until one day when either Jesus returns or you die and go to heaven and are glorified, right? So you have salvation, sanctification, glorification, right? We kind of covered that a little bit in the Ordo Salutis at the beginning of the course. So the language we use points to a singular event in the past. So the Eastern Church does not look at salvation that way. The Eastern Church views salvation on a spectrum. So the Eastern Church would say, I am being saved. So for the Eastern Orthodox Church, salvation, sanctification, and glorification are all under the umbrella of salvation. In fact, you can find videos on YouTube if you want to of Eastern Orthodox priests talking about it. And they're very adamant about it. How can I say that I have been saved? Because I am being saved. Because they don't break up theology. They don't break up the theology of salvation into these sort of separate categories. You know, we in the evangelical church, our approach to studying theology is systematic theology, where we have a system of theology. We have all these categories that we study. You're really hard pressed to find that many systematic theology books in the Eastern Church because that's not how they do theology. It's way more mystic than we are. There's a lot of similarities really between charismatics and Pentecostals in the East in terms of the mysticism. But part of that doctrine of salvation is this idea of theosis. It's theosis, also called deification. You might hear an Eastern Orthodox refer to salvation or theosis as participation in the divine essence or the divine life. Now, in this course on sanctification, we've looked at 2 Peter 1, 3, and 4 before. I'll just read it so that we're all on the same page. Peter writes, His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Verse 4. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. And the words that help us understand theosis, the Eastern Doctrine of Theosis, in that passage are the phrases participate and divine nature. One of the things when you watch the video that you will hear the Eastern Orthodox, and what I might do for people who are watching this video that aren't in this course, I may post a link to that video. In fact, if I can remember it, I'll do that. But what you'll hear this priest say is that what theosis is, and I'm going to talk about what theosis is, but he will say it is God gives us by grace what He is by nature. So this idea of participating, if you read the King James Version, it says partakers of the divine nature or partake in the divine nature. So this Greek word for participate or partake is koinonoi. It's kind of related to koinonia. It means to share or sharer. So if you think about the Greek term that Peter uses here, and you were to put in that word share, which is what koinonoi means. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may share in the divine nature. Now that changes that passage and how that passage can be read if you insert the word share instead of participate. And then divine nature is the aspect of theosis that is the most sort of interesting for us to study, and also the one that causes us a little bit of concern. So when you think about what nature means, God's nature, this is an ontological issue. Ontological meaning being. Ontos is the Greek word for being. So just to make sure you understand the use of the term, ontologically, you are a human being. The little puppy that my wife and I just got, I think I've showed you pictures of it. Ontologically, our dog Annie is a dog, right? So that's the essence of Annie is dog, and the essence of any one of us is human. So God's nature is that aspect of Him that is divine. God is by nature 100% divinity. So you could even say that His essence is that He is divine. I don't think anybody would argue with that philosophically. It's just really important that we grasp that, because the implications of God's nature is really important, because God is there's never a time when God is not fully divine, and there's no part of God that is not fully divine, because it is His essential nature. So what theosis is it's the Eastern doctrine that says that at salvation, one's nature is changed. The human nature is changed. And the convert is transformed, and this is the key term. The converted are transformed by the divine energy of God. So Christian growth for the Eastern Orthodox then is a lifelong pursuit of being a sharer in God's divine energies. The other term that you can use for theosis is deification. Now, that is a loaded term that makes a lot of people really nervous because one of the questions that a lot of people want to ask the Eastern Church is if we are sharing, if we are participating in divine nature, in divinity, if we as humans are sharing in divinity, are you saying that humans can become divine? And so, answer to that is no, because what the Orthodox Church is not saying, they're not saying that you are participating in the divine essence. They're saying that you are participating in the divine energy, and they make a distinction there. Even though this passage says participation in the divine nature, they say that what it means is to participate in the divine energies, which is um, the divine activity of God, the divine presence of God. Again, what we want, because of the way we think in the West and because of the way we're trained, is we want these terms fully defined. What do you mean energies? What do you mean? Right? But the important thing to remember about the Eastern Church is that the Eastern Church is very mystical. They use very mystical languages and they're very comfortable with concepts that they generally understand without all the technical language that we employ in the West. So theosis is participation in the divine energies of God. The best way to understand it is that theosis is union, not fusion. Does that make sense? Union, not fusion, meaning that human nature remains intact. You're just joined to the divine essence. And then union, obviously, with God's divine energies is transformative. So you can't be that. You can't encounter God and not be changed, is what the Eastern Church would say. And if you think about Moses, Moses encountered God and he was changed, his face glowed, right? And so there is this understanding that through the power of the Holy Spirit, a Christian over time participates in God's divine energies, and that participation in divine energies means that because you're connected through your union with God's divine energies, those things that you did and thought before conversion by nature, now you by nature do not do those things because you've been exposed to and transformed by the divine energies of God. Now, here's a question. What's the difference between theosis and sanctification? Because it kind of sound really similar. The problem, at least as far as I can see it, is that it's hard to get theosis from 2 Peter 1:4 because the concept of divine energies is something that it's a theology that they developed from this because they saw problems with a doctrine whereby you participate in the divine essence of God. So this idea of divine energies isn't explicitly stated. And the other problem, you're really surprised by this, what you don't find the term theosis in the writings of the early church. Now, there's an argument to be made that you find elements of theosis, but that same argument can be applied to say that where they see elements of theosis, we see elements of sanctification. So theosis is a tradition that developed in the Eastern Church that became a theological distinctive, and it is a big part of what it means to be Eastern Orthodox. Theosis is a central element to what it means to be Eastern Orthodox. This is not a small doctrine. I think you could argue that the doctrine of sanctification is less important to an evangelical than the doctrine of theosis is to an Eastern Orthodox. But here's what the sort of the so what of all this is. They maintain that part of the Christian life is this mystical connection to God and this constant transformation that comes from being close to the divine nature and getting transformed through union with God's divine energies. And when you have a doctrine that is central to your faith, that encourages you to be unified with God through the Holy Spirit so that you can be transformed, that is certainly a doctrine that most serious Christians can get behind. So here's what I'm not willing to say. I'm not willing to say that theosis is incorrect. What I say is that they use different language and different concepts. And I think at the end of the day, you could make an argument that the Eastern way of explaining theosis is superior to the way evangelicals and Pentecostals try to explain sanctification. Eastern Orthodox attribute any change in human nature after conversion to the divine energies, meaning God is working. They don't attribute it to, if you would just read more, it'll change you. Or, if you just, here's a list, don't do all these things and you'll be better. Yeah. We ignore our own theology. And so what you won't find in the Eastern Church is these nuanced attempts at being transformed. Because for them, there's only one way, and that is to participate in the divine energies, to be as close to God as possible, and being close to God changes a person. And that's the essential doctrine of theosis. And that's it. That's a overview. There are probably 100 different nuances that we didn't cover in this video. But what we're trying to do here is just kind of get an overview so that you can really kind of dig in and understand the video that I posted a little better. But that pretty much does it for the discussion of theosis. I'm going to stop the recording now and let you ask your questions.